Welcome, everybody. This is the second in the Getty series of webinars focused on teaching with the arts during the pandemic. My name is Rebecca Edwards. I'm the Education Specialist for Teacher Programs in the Getty Museum's Education Department, and I'll be your host for the webinar. Today, we're eager to share the Getty Art Challenge with you and to talk about ways it can be used to inspire student learning, both in the remote classroom and in the in-person classroom. Soon after the Getty Art Challenge was launched last spring, we began to receive messages from K-12 teachers sharing all the different ways that they had incorporated the challenge into their classroom. Because of this outpouring of interest, we decided to put together this webinar to share some of the strategies that teachers had shared with us. As we developed this webinar, we focused on general classroom teachers. We wanted to make what we're sharing useful, not just for art teachers, but for teachers working with different grade levels and subject areas, especially in the English language arts and social studies. So we hope that you'll find something useful no matter what your teaching role is. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few practical details for the webinar. First, I'd like to bring your attention to the Q&A window. You'll see it at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please feel free to use that Q&A window to enter any questions or comments that you have. We're planning to leave time at the end of the webinar to share your comments and to answer as many questions as we have time for. Second, I wanted to let you know that we'll be sharing most of the slides from the webinar, along with a list of resources and links that are referenced during the presentation. We'll share the link to these files with you shortly via the chat, and we'll also include them in a follow-up email. We've left out a few of the slides which feature student work, which is for privacy reasons, but the majority you'll receive. Lastly, we have really exciting news. We're excited to be able to offer a free copy of the Getty's Off the Wall book to all webinar participants. This is the book. This book, it features some of the best of from the submissions to the Getty Art Challenge. We were able to make these books available for free thanks to a generous grant from the Genesis Inspiration Foundation. In this time of challenge, the Genesis Inspiration Foundation recognizes the difficulties that many art institutions and educators are facing and kindly offer to support this webinar through the free distribution of Getty resources like this book. At the end of the webinar, I'll be sharing information about how you can provide us with your mailing address if you'd like to receive your free copy of this book. Okay, so with the housekeeping taken care of, I'd like to get us started by getting a sense of who's with us here today. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll. If the device that you're on allows you to respond, we'd love to know a little bit about you. Here comes the poll. I'll give you about 30 seconds to go ahead and answer. We have two questions for you about what grade and subjects you teach in. Okay, about 60% of the votes are in. I'll give it just a few more seconds. We're almost there. Thank you, everybody. We're up to 89%. Give you a couple more seconds. Okay, great, thank you. I'm gonna go ahead and share who's here today, just so that you can get an idea of who else is participating. We also like to get a sense of who's with us. I see we have a lot of elementary core teachers, English language arts, social studies and history, and visual arts. Well, hopefully we'll have something for all of you today. Okay, so I'm going to stop that share. Okay, so now that we've all gotten a sense of who's in the room, I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Darcy Beeman-Black. Darcy is an Associate Education Specialist for Teacher Programs at the Getty Museum. And prior to the Getty, she worked as the Youth Initiative Coordinator at the National Ornamental Metal Museum in Memphis, Tennessee. Darcy's been working closely with the Getty on our K-12 programs, especially our teacher programs, and we're so excited for her to present some of what she's learned in her work in the last year via this webinar. So with that introduction, I'd like to hand over our virtual floor to Darcy.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you for joining us, everybody. I'm going to start my presentation with this quote. The Getty Art Challenge speaks to the power of art to bond us together. Art invites us into the experience of others and connects us with our shared past. In isolation, a sense of community is sacred. And I pulled this from a blog from the two Getty staff who kind of spearheaded the Getty Art Challenge. And one of the things that sticks out to me when it comes to, incorporating this into your classroom is the part about the experience of others. And, we can learn by experiencing others' work or dissecting others' work. And I think that that's sort of the part that we're going to be talking about today, is how we can connect our shared past by the act of recreation. So I'm also going to share, sort of to kick off, what the Getty Art Challenge is. I'm going to share a video. It's the promo video for our Off the Walls book, which you guys will be getting, but it kind of just in a short 1-minute video shares what the Getty Challenge is all about.
And now some homegrown creativity.
Oh, sorry about that. I'm going to start it again.
And now some homegrown creativity. A social media challenge that is drawing responses from around the world.
What started as a light pass-the-time challenge from one of the world's great art museums is now a shelter-in-place phenomenon. The Getty Museum Challenge.
Results: hilarious, inspiring, and adorable.
This challenge is clearly connecting people to art in new and creative ways, and offering the rest of us a smile in the process.
A bit of creativity for the quarantine era, where life is beginning to imitate art.
Okay, so hopefully in that video you saw a lot of examples, and it already started getting your mind thinking about, what your students can do. I do want to share in the next slide the 3 rules of the Getty Art Challenge. So as you can see, there's only 3 rules, but if you notice some of the output of some of the participants and some of the submissions, there was a variety of engagement and time put in and materials used. And so one of the things that I think is really cool is that there's 3 rules at the foundation, but there is a breadth of variation in how people were engaged with this challenge. And so I think we're going to take the spirit of that, and I'm going to share with you how you can take that into the classroom and maybe dig deeper into some of these rules, or change some rules, or focus on some rules more than others. So you can see that the first rule is choose your favorite artwork, find 3 things lying around the home, and then recreate the artwork with those items. So I'm going to share with you some places where you can find submissions. So as you're maybe doing some research, and maybe after you get your book and you look through the book, there are some places where you can look at what people are submitting even today. So if you go to the Instagram hashtag, which you don't need the Instagram app to look at, you can just go to their website in any browser, and you can search the Instagram website for that hashtag, and that link will be in those materials that we shared with you at the beginning in the Google Drive. So you can see it'll have a top post page, and those do change. And one thing I also like about seeing what people are submitting in live time is that you can see maybe what was successful, maybe something that was less successful, maybe some things that people did that you never thought, that someone could pull off, but they did. And so you can really see a lot of variations and skill levels by looking at what people are posting on social media. I mean, even in this screenshot I took of what's on the hashtag now, you can see there's a variation of how deep people went into it. You know, if we look at the Frida Kahlo one here in the on the side here, you can see, you know, she has makeup and she used her pets, it looks like, and stuffed animals, and she had a background. But then you see the one next to it, and it's just a couple with masks on that took on the same pose as the photograph they were trying to recreate. So I think this is a good place to start if you want to see a lot of variety. And then there's also a Facebook post where people were including their submissions there. So if you have Facebook, you can look on there also. And one of my favorite sources to look at was the Getty Iris blog. The reason I liked it is because it didn't just have the images and the recreations, but it also gives a little bit of narrative about the experiences that people had when they were doing the challenge. So for example, if we look at this medieval manuscript page here in the center, in the recreation is using pasta and food. There's a sweet story here about how a mother was sitting at the table with her 5-year-old, and they decided to do the challenge, and they worked together to create this composition that you see here using pasta, and it looks like a tomato and eggs. And then, so there's a little bit more context. And then you can also see the variety of use of items like I was mentioning earlier. So if we look at the Van Gogh irises, we see that there's, you know, beads used as dirt, and this is cut up carrots. So you really, in this article, are able to get a little bit deeper into the process that people were using. And then of course, there's the vacuum over here, recreating the harp player. And then I did want to break down the book a little bit. Some of you may have it, some, you know, you all will eventually have it if you'd like it. But I do want to point out that there are, the way that it's separated might really help you in your research as you're looking at images for inspiration. Some of the ones that I thought might work well with students is the strike a pose, where, you know, you're literally using your body, and we're going to get into that. And then, you know, there's also levels of how deep people got into it. So for example, the high drama section, you know, some people made sculptures to wear out of newspaper, or, you know, really went above and beyond and incorporated makeup and things like that. And then another thing about this challenge that we've noticed through submissions that we think makes it a really good activity or incorporation into your classrooms is that it's super versatile. So you'll see a lot of age groups in some of the submissions. You know, you'll see kids, you'll see adults, you'll see families, you'll see pets, you know, and a lot of, it's, you know, it's 3 simple rules. And so it's easy to kind of take from one level to the other. Obviously the materials are really accessible because it's literally in the rules. Find 3 things in your house that are around you. There's a wide range of approaches. So we saw, you know, some people just took one item and did it. And then other people, you know, took, you know, they had all their pets and their whole family, and they went outside and they thought about camera angles. And then that also kind of relates to the varying levels of successful engagement. So, you know, you don't have to rebuild the whole scene out of paint and cardboard, and, you know, you don't have to be a skilled, you know, what we would think of as a formal skilled artist in order to, you know, have a successful piece. And then of course the rules are simple, which I've talked about already. And then there's a high adaptability to different subjects and topics, which I will get into a little bit in the next section. So now that I've showed you, you know, a little overview of what the Getty Challenge is and where to find the source, or where to find submissions, I'll kind of go over what my section and the rest of our meeting today is going to look like. So today we're going to share learning opportunities in the classroom. I'm going to have a slide where I show some areas that we saw, or some opportunities we saw where you can really incorporate a lot of learning into this challenge. Curriculum connections to ELA and social studies. I do highlight some of the anchor standards for Common Core and content standards So that way you can look, I didn't put the specific numbers, but I just put the areas that you can look in where you might be able to attach those standards. And then also ways to structure a lesson. So just some tips and tricks and things to think about when you're assigning the Getty Art Challenge in lessons with your students. And then rules to consider breaking or tweaking for the classroom. So, you know, do you want them to use Photoshop or not? We'll talk about that a little bit. And then student-friendly approaches found in submissions. Hopefully you've already seen a couple that might inspire you. And then we have Lisa and Wendy, that are next speakers, who are going to be talking a little bit more deeply about some applications that you can use in your classroom. All right, so here is a grid of learning opportunities that you could use in various situations. You could build out different areas of the challenge. So it is only 3 rules, but you could, focus more on picking your favorite work of art. This will give students the opportunity to research the topic, compare and contrast different pieces of work, formulate ideas and opinions about why they like artwork or why they don't. And then also, picking the 3 items could be a whole plan. Trying to figure out how you're going to plan out the project is a really big one. And then, exercise problem solving skills. What 3 items are you going to use and why? And of course, problem solving through creation is another one. Okay, so ways to structure a lesson using the Getty Art Challenge. Again, these are just kind of things to think about that might help you when structuring a lesson. So much like I did with you earlier, it's a good idea to maybe share just an overview of the challenge, get their minds thinking about it, discuss submissions with students. It could be, a video or, show an image of the work of art and then a recreation, and then really dissect it. Why is it successful? What are the items and methods that were used? Where was the photo taken? Where was the location? Where was the camera placed? You can really pick out any image, and then also different approaches. So here I've made a grid of a lot of different things. So if we look at the Madonna and Child down at the bottom left, you can see that recreation, there's a dog and a towel, and they were able to communicate that recreation with only really 2 items. I guess if you count the couch, that would be a third, or themselves would be the third. And then another one I want to call attention to is the lady with iguanas on her head. And, you could talk about, why is that recreation successful? And then this would also be a good one to talk about the camera angle. Is the camera up high? Is it down low? So you could really go through a lot of recreations with your students and kind of overview what would happen if they recreated it. Another thing to consider is assigning an approach that complements your lesson, unit, or subject area. And Wendy will be kind of going into that. She used the approach of recreating art with a specific theme or topic. And that's one way to do it. And the 3 I have here are only 3. There may be more out there that you might think of. But if you provide a list of artworks for your student to choose from, or, it has to be Egyptian art, for example, or it has to be from a certain time period or depict a certain historical event, you might take that approach. Another approach would be, this is about identity. Put yourself in a work of art. Choose a work of art that you want to change with yourself in it. And then another approach would be, recreate a work of art using a specific material. Maybe you want to really challenge your students. Maybe you're a visual arts teacher and you want everyone to use, buttons or, some kind of maybe recycled materials only or something like that. You could also take that approach. So you can see that recreation is the wave with Legos and building blocks. And I just really want to say, like, these little Legos at this bottom right that create the boat, I think was really clever how they did the little curve up here. And then also, share a lot of different possibilities of how they can recreate. So I put a couple here that kind of stood out to me. So there's strike a pose, and then there's, you know, the found object approach, and then, you know, maybe toys only, you know, they can only use toys, uh, Legos, figures, dolls, etc. And then, you know, you can go all out, you know, invite them if they want to use face paint, if they want to do some sewing or create costumes, or, you know, I mean, they could go all the way out if that's something that you want them to do, or explore if they want to explore that. And so here I've put ways, so there are ways that you can take each one of those rules in the Getty challenge and you can expand on them and really enrich the challenge and take different or take deeper dives into each one. So for example, you know, research the work of art. I mean, that's rule number one of the challenge. You might be able to take that really far. So you could have them write about it. They could create a bibliography of all the sources. And you'll see down below, I put some of the anchor standards that you could attach to this deeper dive. But you know, you could really have the research project be its own part. And then another one is plan and organize the project. Maybe that's, you know, that's kind of rule number two, right? Like, pick the 3 items and, you know, figure that out. So you could really build that out and expand on that, and have them plan out, you know, who, what, with what, where, when is this going to happen? What are some special considerations? Do they need to be outside, inside? What does the background look like? Things like that. And then maybe you take an approach where it's all about the photograph. And, you know, you can teach your students to be a photographer so they can focus on the composition. You know, where is that camera? How is it positioned? How far away is it from me? And you can really dissect those things out, you know, identify what the lighting is. Where is the light source coming from? So you could really focus on the art part of it. Maybe even think about what the artist's choices were and why the artist chose those choices in the original work. And then another deeper dive you could do is, you know, really focus on reflecting on the experience. You know, they can write about how it went for them. And that could be, you know, their personal reflections. But then you can also invite them to reflect on each other's work. I mean, the Getty Art Challenge was a social media challenge. And so there was that element of sharing with that. So you could incorporate that aspect of the challenge into your classroom. And hopefully they would receive feedback, which is also a learning experience of its own, and then give feedback to others. All right, and then I also wanted to include some apps that you can use for, you know, you want to think about ways that your students can share and respond to each other's work. Some of these can be adapted into the classroom, in the in-person classroom or a blended hybrid classroom, or they could be all digital. I know many of you are probably still teaching from a distance. And so I did include a couple here. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of all of them, but I did leave you with a little blurb underneath one of like how you could apply these apps to encourage sharing between your students with this project. So for example, Padlet, it's kind of like this collaborative multimedia bulletin board, and Wendy's actually going to share that one, so I won't get too deep into that one. And then the next 2 or 3, so Spiral, Google Slides, and Google Photos. Google Slides, you can have your students add their own slide into a presentation, and then with Spiral, you can actually present that Google Slides presentation in live time, and students can comment on each other's work while you're presenting that slideshow. So that's something you may want to look into. And then also Google Photos. Maybe you want all of your students to share their photos with you, and then you put them all in a photo album on Google Photos, and then they can like or comment on those photos, much like a social media platform. And then we have Artsonia, which basically allows you to set up an online gallery for your students, and they can comment on each other's work. You can also share it out publicly or to parents. There's a lot of different ways to lock it down or expand on it. And then kind of a simpler one is if you're using Zoom, you could use a Zoom background so they could use their photograph, their end result as their background on Zoom. And then that way you can sort of create a Zoom art gallery with your students in live time, and you can all compare your work with each other through conversation or chat or however you engage with your students in a group. And then finally, I do want to talk about some rules that you can tweak or break or create. So, you know, thinking about something that came up when we were talking to teachers was, you know, some students wanted to buy objects for the challenge. You know, that may come up for you, so you might want to have that conversation. You know, the Getty Art Challenge did kind of lean on the spirit of found objects, but maybe if you have a student that's really passionate about something and they really want to get one thing to include in their project, you know, you may run into that. So you may want to make a decision about, you know, do we allow buying objects or not? And then another thing you might do is add in a found object from outside. Maybe everyone has to choose an object from outside of their house to include. Maybe everyone has to use the same objects. So maybe there's a material or something that you know all of your students have, and they have to incorporate that. And then you might, you know, see what kind of creativity comes out of that. And then also, you know, don't just choose your favorite object and try to, you know, match that object to a piece of art. You know, it may be interchangeable. You know, you may have a student that's like, I really want to use my vacuum cleaner, you know, or something like that, and maybe encourage your students to think about why they're attached to that object, and it just may affect how their experience with the Getty Art Challenge ends up shaking out. And then I think a big one is Photoshop versus no Photoshop, but then there's also the, you know, image filters. So if you guys remember the lady with iguanas photo I showed earlier, it was in black and white. So maybe you have some parameters, like maybe you can add black and white, but we don't want you adding a lot of Photoshop elements, or maybe you're okay with Photoshop elements. And I think outlining that ahead of time might help you discover what the best thing is for you and your situation. And then invite family members versus no family members. Do you want this to be a solo project? Do you want it to be collaborative? I think that there's pluses and minuses to both depending on your situation, so it might be something to think about. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Rebecca, and she will introduce the next speaker.
Great. Thank you, Darcy. I appreciate everything that you've shared, and I want to just give everybody a reminder that those links to those platforms that Darcy was mentioning will be included in the Google Drive folder that we've shared the link with you for. So before we get started with the next section, I wanted to share a little bit about why we've decided to include the two people that we have. We have two case studies. We're calling them case studies. They're sort of test cases of how you might apply the Getty Art Challenge to a very specific context. And the first of our speakers is Lisa Davis. And she's been an education specialist at the Getty Villa since 2015, and her focus is on the K-12 audience. And one of her roles at the Getty is to guide our virtual art exploration program, which is in a sense a virtual classroom or virtual field trip program that we began offering when we were no longer able to offer in-person field trips. And she, in her teaching in that program with K-12 students, has been using a teaching technique that we thought was really applicable as a setup for the Getty Art Challenge. So we asked her if she could share it in the context of this webinar to give participants a kind of a concrete idea of a teaching strategy that you could use in your classroom that only takes a few minutes, that leads into a Getty Art Challenge project. So Just a bit about Lisa before I hand it over to her. In addition to her work at the Getty Villa, previously she served as the education director at the Lux Art Institute in San Diego. She was also the manager of teacher initiatives at the Smart Museum in Chicago and docent coordinator at the High Museum in Atlanta. So with that, Lisa, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank you for everyone for inviting me to do this today, and for all of you for joining us, for taking the time to be with us. So the activity that I'll share with you today is called Strike a Pose, which Darcy was referencing. It's one of that I've done with all ages, both on Zoom, as we've been presenting these virtual art explorations, and something that we used to do in the galleries. So if you're working online or in person or hybrid, you can consider something like this. And it's a really fun and easy activity. Most kids, you know, the younger grades, TK through 5th, will do it pretty easily. Older grades may be a little more hesitant, but often if you sort of acknowledge the playfulness of it, and if you do it yourself, and if you communicate the goal of this activity, you might see some interaction even from those high school students. So this is called Strike a Pose activity. And with Strike a Pose, students can use movement and senses to develop their understanding of a narrative in a work of art, and can express this understanding by capturing it via the Getty Art Challenge, as we were just discussing. Striking a pose encourages students to explore characters, setting, and plot by taking on those poses, activating their senses, and practicing empathy using a work of art as the focal point. And Strike a Pose engage physically, right? We have to engage physically before we can engage mentally and emotionally. So as with the Getty Art Challenge, it encourages play. We activate the imagination, we build those close looking skills, and practice empathy as they use their imagination to put themselves into the artwork. So today I'd like to demonstrate this activity, and unfortunately, since we are in a webinar, I'm going to call upon my fellow panelists to serve as my students for right now, and I will encourage you at home to play along if you are feeling brave. So with all of these activities, I'll provide a direction for the main activity, as well as modification for older or younger students, and also modifications to ensure that I'm being inclusive. So panelists, you'll turn your screens on. And right now, everybody loosen up a little bit. So if you feel comfortable, I'm going to invite you to please stand up. And if you don't feel comfortable standing, you can also do this pose in your chair, just by sitting up straight and making small movements to broaden your shoulders and stretch out your arms. We're going to start by focusing on the figure in the center of this painting. And I want you to take the pose of that figure. So, students, can someone please describe how we should stand?
Leaning forward.
Okay, great. So you're going to lean forward a little bit. Anyone else?
Putting our weight on our left foot.
Excellent. Okay, putting your weight on your left foot. That's a great one. So with older students who may be more hesitant to talk, as the teacher, you might have to be the leader a little bit on this with your description. And for younger students, you want to be maybe a little more specific. So something like, can one of you tell us which foot goes forward and which goes behind? Which arm is holding the sword behind? Can one of my students answer?
The right.
Excellent. Okay, and which arm is stretched out front?
The left.
Excellent. You're doing great, Darcy. So let's think about what the artist is communicating. And while we're in this pose, can you use one adjective, one describing word to describe how you're feeling as the character or in this action?
I feel pretty powerful and forceful.
Great. Great adjectives, Rebecca. Nice. Anyone else? Anything else?
I feel really strong.
Excellent, great. Great adjectives, strong. I've heard triumphant before, powerful, excellent adjectives. Yeah, great. Thank you all so much. All right, you all were excellent students. Thank you. I will invite you to take a seat now, relax, shake it out. Thank you, fellow panelists, for modeling a few ways that this can work. In the interest of time, I'm going to walk just briefly through a few other approaches to invite students to really immerse themselves in the artwork. So I'm going to think about kind of the sensory part of things. And just keep in mind that anything that I'm sharing with you right now, you can go deeper or invest more time as you see fit, as you have time in your classroom. For example, with the last request to describe how the character is feeling, you could ask students to cite visual evidence, otherwise known as giving support for their ideas, thus addressing the Common Core standards. So next we're going to use our senses to explore the character, plot, and setting of this artwork. So imagine you are this character. Name 5 things you can see. And you would do this pretty slowly, go through this slowly. So name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things that you smell, 2 things you can touch or feel, and 1 emotion. So you take your time and get the responses back from those questions. And you can also do that as a writing activity. This artwork that you're seeing in front of you is one that I would use with grades 3 and up. For younger, it may be a little too sensitive or violent. So I'm gonna demonstrate this with another artwork, with one other artwork, and this is in the Villa collection. So this is, so what I'm gonna ask you to do is notice the sculpture also has a central figure. So you can discuss those same ideas of character, and you can discover the relationships that each figure has with the other. By asking again to strike a pose, you can have them choose one figure to focus on. You can ask them questions like, which one did you choose and why? And if you're going to write a thought bubble, this is my favorite one. If you were to write a thought bubble for that character, what would the thought bubble say and what would they be saying to each other? So lastly, to transition to a writing activity, you could actually ask them to write out what that dialogue is between the characters. You can ask them to describe the story, the plot, the character setting again, considering the sequence of what happened. So this is a good one to think about what happened maybe a minute before this moment and what's going to happen next. And lastly, you might ask, what is one thing that you see that might be a clue about what is happening now? Let's imagine what happened 1 minute ago and what will happen next. So really by asking for that clue is getting them to consider why they're making these decisions. And so our last section, I'll just give you some considerations for use in your classroom. As you can see, strike a pose can really work as like a bumper activity or an introduction to a language arts class, or just a way to sort of wake them up and activate them in the middle of a class. So we want to engage them physically, mentally, and emotionally to get them to engage, to access the artwork, and to potentially transition to other curricular areas through a different modality. That's all I have to share with you today, and I look forward to answering any of our questions and answers in a little while. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. One of the reasons that we thought that Lisa's activity would work so well for especially elementary students was because of our awareness of the intensive coverage of narrative topics in the ELA curriculum, and the opportunity to integrate arts into simple conversation practice of sequencing words and other things that you are likely already doing if you're an elementary school ELA teacher. So our next presenter is Wendy Schramm. And Wendy was at the beginning of this webinar, I mentioned that the Getty heard from a lot of different teachers who had been incorporating the Getty Art Challenge into their classrooms in different ways. And Wendy was one of the people who reached out to us to share the projects that she had been doing with her 6th grade students. And we found it to be such a great application of the Getty Art Challenge as linked to the 6th grade social studies curriculum, that we wanted to create an opportunity for her to share it more broadly. So Wendy is a middle school social studies, literature, and film teacher at the Rhodes School in Encinitas. And in addition to her work as a teacher, she's passionate about nature, writing, teaching through the arts, and wishes that we can once again go to the movies. So Wendy's going to go ahead and share with us the project that she did last spring with her students when she was covering her Egypt unit. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to you, Wendy.
Hello, everyone, and I am so happy to be part of this panel today. So I'm just going to briefly explain the background of how this came about in my class. This took place deep into the lockdown last year when we were all struggling to figure out how to deliver content online. And we were in the midst of our big unit on Egypt, which I usually teach long and lovingly and also earlier in the year than I did last year. It was getting towards the end of the year, very tough time. the kids had such debilitating Zoom fatigue at that point, that I felt like I really needed to come up with a final activity for our Egypt unit that could get them away from the screens. And the Getty challenge seemed the perfect thing at that moment. I had been introduced to the Getty challenge. A friend of mine had sent me the Twitter feed, and when I looked at it for the first time, this was early into the challenge, I thought it was just charming, creative, and hilarious, all rolled into one. And I had that in the back of my mind. And so months later, I pulled it out to apply to this particular unit. So let's move on. And the first problem in this remote setting, and it doesn't, you can, clearly you can do this challenge in person. It doesn't have to be remotely, but it did lend itself very well to delivering in a remote setting as well. So my first issue was, well, how do I deliver everything that I need to deliver in order to make this a seamless project for them to work on? Without stressing out how to find the different things that they needed to find. We had been told that we needed to use Seesaw as a platform, and I found myself very frustrated with the limitations of Seesaw. And frequently I use Seesaw as a conduit to just link them to other things. And so I use the web-based program called Some More, which is a free program. The paid program has a lot more bells and whistles. And you might be seeing some things on the right side of the screen. And those things do not appear when you push this out to your own students. So I went ahead and outlined the Getty challenge, recreate your favorite artwork using just 3 objects lying around the house. And I went ahead and showed them several examples, which the kids just thought were so hilarious. And if we click on one of those in Some More, this is called the gallery. And so if you click on something in the gallery view, you can get a nice large picture of it, which is just great for when you're delivering this content over Zoom. So if we scroll down a little bit more, oh, and when I chose these particular items, I really had in mind, okay, what can they do at home? What can they do reasonably? So I didn't pick the more complicated ones. And then I rephrased it in my own challenge, and I'm going to show you a truncated version of that in the next slide in just a minute. And then I had expectations that I laid out for what I was after. And then at the bottom of the Some More, close to the bottom, I chose several pieces of Egyptian art with the recommendation that if they wanted to go ahead and choose a different piece, that was a-okay, but I wanted to give them a few pieces, again, that were very kid-friendly to emulate. And then also I had a writing component for this. So at the very bottom of this Some More, I have a PDF on, which we don't need to open now, but that outlines exactly what I expected for the paragraph that they were supposed to write to go along with this. And then finally, I have my summary of expectations. And if you can read it, it's kind of small, but if you can read it, the number 1 is have fun with this. So let's go on to the next slide. And this again is a shortened version, but you're going to be getting a link to the Some More that I just showed, and you'll be getting another link to, and everything is spelled out on that Some More. So essentially, they need to choose a piece of ancient Egyptian art, determine how they wanted to copy it using only the items that were around the house, take a photograph, and then upload that photo to a Padlet, and we're going to look at that Padlet in just a minute, and then add a brief paragraph stating the title of the piece and an interesting fact about ancient Egypt. So let's go to the Padlet, to the next slide. Okay, so this is just a screenshot. We're going to go live and I'll show you my Padlet, and we're just going to talk a little bit about how it works in case you've never used it. It is a super, super easy thing to use. It also is free with some, again, some limitations, but it's this wonderful bulletin board. And earlier, Darcy had talked about collaboration and feedback. This allows students to comment on their friends' work, and then, you know, receive commentary on their own. So on the left-hand column, I have a read this first with my directions on how specifically they're supposed to upload their materials. And I would say that I had about a 90% success rate of everybody uploading it exactly the way we're supposed to. So if we can just scroll down on one of the pieces and take a look, just go up and down, and you'll see that there was a step 1, a step 2, and a step 3. So step 1 is to have the original piece of art. Step 2 is to have their own version. That cat was particularly uncooperative, so I wouldn't say that this was the best example. And then step 3, their explanatory or their informational paragraph. So we can move on to the next slide and get back to the keynote. And I'm going to show you some student work up close and personal. So here we have this lovely water vase or water carrier from ancient Egypt. The lines are just so elegant. And less elegant is the toilet plunger that my student used, but you can see that he did indeed use what was around the house, which was what the spirit of the Getty Challenge was all about. This one I really love. It's so clever. So she took a laundry basket, and the face, we have a pink eraser for the lips. I think it might be a magic rub eraser for the nose. She stole some hibiscus out front yard for the flowers up at top. And then for the hands, oh, she's got a pasta necklace. And then for the hands, it looks like we have these wonderful toe socks for the hands. And then to me, the absolute pinnacle of this is the golden amulets and bracelets and rings from the original are now our Pepperidge Farm goldfish crackers, which I thought was a fabulous touch. Okay, here we have, and there really aren't that many things going. I mean, you know, there's a lot of she really put some thought into this, and yes, indeed, she added makeup, which was great. They did a backdrop. You can see that there's full family involvement with this, which I very much encourage, and which I don't usually, because parents take over the child's projects. But this was just a joyous activity. So she has that lovely, lovely dress that has Post-it notes on it. And then this next one, I want you to look top side on both the original piece of art and then on the student piece of art. I just adore those popcorn boxes on a cake platter. And I don't know how she managed to balance on what looks like a TV tray, and I probably don't want to know what happened next. So let's go to one more. Pets were definitely requisitioned. I love this one. And here, The one on the right, my student, I have no idea how she got all those chicks to stay still long enough for a good photo, but I definitely give her kudos for that. And then we also have Anubis, and then we have Anubis. And then finally, I really love this one. And whereas when Lisa was talking about striking a pose, she had this very dramatic painting of the beheading of Medusa. And this is so much subtler. But you can see that these three sisters absolutely lived through this piece of art. They struck a pose that's so subtle and gentle, and yet they really, really captured the feel of this piece of Egyptian art. And I also wanted to linger on this one because of the paragraph that was included. So if you can take a quick look at that paragraph. And I shortened it quite a bit, and you don't need to read the whole thing, but she did a very nice job on it. But the last line, I think, is particularly wonderful in this, when she states, although this statue might not look as important as others, it represents the true value of family bonds. And when times are uncertain, that is the only thing that matters. And that really actually goes right back to the opening slide that we saw and from the blog post, in which the final line was, in isolation, a sense of community is sacred. And that was something that just grew organically through my giving the students the Getty Challenge. They absolutely loved it. I can't speak highly enough of it. It is in the classroom. It allowed for ease of adaptation. It promoted ingenuity on the part of the students, and it allowed them to flex their creative muscles. And once again, I know I've said this, but it allowed them to kind of live through these pieces of art, which I think was a very powerful as well as a joyous experience. So that is my experience of the Getty Challenge, which I think you can adapt to any grade all the way up through college.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Thank you for sharing that. It's always really fun to look at student images created during the Getty Art Challenge. I'm still mind boggled about how that student happened to have all those chicks around his or her home. So I want to go ahead now and transition to the Q&A. Thank you all for those of you who are submitting questions and comments in the Q&A. Feel free, if you haven't and you have a burning question, to go ahead and add yours. I'd like to start out with our first question, and maybe Darcy could start by tackling this question, and then maybe others of the speakers will have some thoughts about it as well. So the first question is as follows. Participation and family involvement is an issue at the Title I school where I work in Los Angeles. Are there suggestions for this particular challenge that are made difficult by the pandemic? Or looking for, I think, are there suggestions for increasing participation and family involvement? And Darcy worked very closely at some of the Getty's partner schools that were also Title I schools that struggled with some of the same challenges. So I'll mute myself, and Darcy, you can go.
Yeah. Well, I think the fact that families are in close proximity to each other, and they're, you don't have the student at the school, and you might be able to access those parents a little bit more through what you're showing their child. That might be one way to kind of get the excitement up on the challenge. I don't, building relationships with the parents, I think, you know, maybe catching their eye through a funny Getty Art Challenge piece might be a suggestion. I don't know, Wendy or Lisa, do you have any suggestions for that?
I can go first. I think if you are very aware of their home situation and the culture of their home, that possibly you can you can show some artwork as examples that they might see themselves in, and that might inspire them a little bit more to join in. Yeah.
I had two thoughts. One is just maybe considering inviting them just as it's a humorous thing to do, then maybe setting that time aside with those families. They might just, you know, in the middle of a day or a night, since we're all home all the time, just having that time, maybe marking it on their calendar and setting it aside when everybody is potentially home. Another thought I was having was just if they could bring in, you know, a family portrait, a picture if they have. They could even do cutouts. That might be kind of fun for them to still engage their family, but even if their family is not able to be present. And then lastly, of course, there's the individual images, the self-portraits, or you know, things that they could do really with themselves. And maybe they could bring in you know, stuffed animals and things like that to stand in for their family. Might be just something kind of fun for them.
I was also thinking, you know, there's social media trends where you recreate a childhood photo with your family. That might be an option. You know, maybe the content that you're offering is choose a family photo from, you know, the past and recreate that, and maybe that would engage the family.
Okay, so I have two questions for Wendy. One is, do students need a Padlet.com account to post pictures and comments? Did you have each student post a picture first, then all students were able to comment on each other's pictures?
I didn't. I have used Padlet for so many things, including for feedback. On this one, I didn't use it for feedback, but it's a cinch. It's super easy to use. My students did have an account and one of the reasons that I do that, it's a free account. They don't have to use their real name or anything. Just their first name is fine. But the reason I do that is that if they don't make an account, all their posts come up as anonymous. And if you're giving feedback to other people, that idea of anonymity can get into all the problems that we have with anonymity in social media. So I prefer that their name is displayed and that they do it that way. But I don't think that they actually need to make an account. I think that you can send an invitation link. It's just that beware of the fact that they come up as anonymous if they're making comments.
And then I have one more for you, Wendy.
Mm-hmm.
There was a question about how do you evaluate the student contributions? Did you use social studies, art, Common Core standards, or some other approach?
I used social studies standards for this one, but I could have easily used English and language arts standards as well. Yeah, and visual arts. It is, I mean, the Getty Challenge it's so cross-curricular that you really can use it to tick off a lot of necessary standards.
Okay, great. Okay, so here's another question. I'm gonna direct this one to Lisa. The question was about second grade. What type of art is most appropriate for the second grade, like let's say the lower elementary age group? Landscapes, portraits, and so on.
I think that's a great question. You can really do anything with second grade. They're so open and flexible, I would say probably you could start with a portrait just to keep it simple and keep it focused. And then once you've practiced a little bit with the portrait, you could branch out. I would say keep it narrative. A landscape is a little more challenging, but a narrative artwork that is not, the Perseus confronting Medusa is, like I said, pretty violent. So you want to think about your subject, but really thinking about that narrative and focus, keeping them focused. So that, hopefully that helps.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so here's a question I'm going to direct to Wendy. How do you encourage parent involvement without having them take control of the project? And this, the person asking is asking more specific to lower grade levels and up, you know, looking at both lower and upper grade levels, I think.
Well, I've done things in the past where I have specified very concretely that I've spelled out parent involvement, which is you may drive your child to Michael's, but that's the extent of your involvement. And it sort of depends. It's always so hard to keep parents, you know, their hands off, especially I think in the younger grades. In the middle school grades, it's a little bit easier because I do enter, this is just an example, but I do enter a literary contest that we have down in San Diego called Read, Imagine, Create. And it's part of the National Endowment for the Arts. And I know from knowing the people who judge this, if they feel like there's too much parental oversight, they just, the child doesn't go anywhere in the contest. And I spell that out very concretely when we do that. So it's difficult, but I think that you can come up with some parameters. And you know how kids are. They'll go home and say, oh, you know, Mrs. Schramm says that you can't do this, you know, that this has to be mine. And so I think with the younger grades that if you go over that idea, that it might help. It's always difficult.
Okay, so we've covered most of the questions we've gotten. There's one last one that I'd like to cover, which was asking about the deadline for the submission to Getty Art Challenge. And so the Getty Art Challenge is ongoing, right? Right, Darcy? So there's no deadline. It's an ongoing, it lives ongoing on social media. There's always rolling submissions. Every time I check, I see new submissions. So there is no deadline. It's something you can continue to do in the years to come.
And I will add to that it's filtered into most social media platforms. You can find the hashtag and you can find submissions.
All right. So that wraps up I think we've covered all the Q&A. We're a little bit over time, so I want to wrap it up. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We hope you'll join us for the next webinar in this series, which is called The Pandemic in Art. It's on January 27th. And we've also included in this last slide the email for teacher programs at the Getty. We'd love for you to email us and share your thoughts, your ideas, and your suggestions. Please feel free to reach out to us via that email address. We'd also appreciate your feedback specifically on this webinar via a survey that will pop up on the screen at the end of this webinar. It's only 7 questions. Some of them are optional, so it's very quick to fill out. And here's how you can request that we mail you the Off the Walls book. So once you complete the survey and you press the submit button, you'll get a pop-up screen. And I think what I'll do is I'll go ahead and share what that looks like. Okay, so here's what you'll see at the end of the webinar. Here's the quick survey. I'm gonna just fill it out with pretend answers. Oh. And once you get to the end of this survey, oh, there's a submit button, which for some reason I'm not showing here. So at the end of the survey, you'll have a submit button. And when you push the submit button, it will pull up a screen which has a link to this form. And this form you can use to give us your name and address that you'd like us to mail the Off the Walls book to. So additionally, in case for any reason you lose the survey or it closes on your screen, we'll also be sending out a follow-up email after the webinar, which includes the link to the survey, which will also take you to this screen where you can give us your mailing address. Okay, so last but not least, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. I'd like to encourage you to fill out the survey, and I'd like to thank the Generous Inspiration Foundation for making it possible for us to give away the Off the Wall books to you. We hope you have a great evening, and we hope to see you again in 2021.